Hello, this is Michael. This video is not really a video. You don't have to watch it. It's just me reading the rules, or more specifically, the how to play, the guide on getting started for Mansions of Madness 2nd edition. It hasn't arrived in my mail yet, so I have here the 1st edition box kind of in the background. But I'm going to read aloud the how to play guide, including the flavor text or fluff as well. So you can skip past that if you like. This is supposed to help you get started, and it's done in the same way that Eldritch Horror came with a how-to guide, how to get started, and then a rules reference as well, meant to check later on after you had already read the how to play and had a grasp of the basics. So let's go ahead and get started, and it's just me reading off this PDF printed off here, so the visuals won't necessarily match up depending on how I'm aiming it here. We start with the flavor text. The house on the hill. The moon loomed huge and awful in the sky. Rita was having second thoughts about the whole business, standing there alone under the eyes of the stars. The longer she stood there, looking up at the heavens, the further she saw, and the limitless gulf of infinity widened above her. She looked anyway, looked at the house sprawling on top of the hill, anything to avoid that awful moon, that impossible sky. The house was not an improvement, dark and monolithic, a silent sentinel, looking down over the Miskatonic River valley below, over the sleeping city of Arkham, Massachusetts. Its silence was malevolent, and Rita could not believe she had thought she would go inside, missing students or no. Art thou not, fatal vision, sensible to feeling as to sight? The voice came from down the hill, pitched to carry, and Rita could see Yorick approaching, a lantern glowing in one hand. Or art thou but a dagger of the mind, a false creation, proceeding from the heat-oppressed brain? She stepped out from where she lurked under an apple tree, waving. She never had been so happy to see the loony old man in her life. "What," she said, "is Horatio there?" "A piece of him," Yorick answered. He flourished the bough. "Into the grave digger, stage right. Is our company assembled?" "Just you and me so far, Yorick." She looked back up the hill at the evil house. "I guess no one else is coming. Might as well head home and get some sleep." "Screw your courage to the sticking place, my friend." The grave digger clapped her on the shoulder. He smiled of earth, of normal things she could touch and taste. Infinity did not seem so bad. "The others will be along directly." He nodded down the lane, and Rita turned. Lights stabbed through the darkness, and soon became a pair of headlights, careening and caroming up the street ahead of a growling, and, to Rita's eyes, quite expensive automobile. The car came to a stop and quieted. The lights flickered out. Preston Fairmont stepped out of the driver's side door, followed by an odd-looking old lady Rita had never seen before. Agatha Crane, she presumed. "Now listen," said Fairmont, first to speak as always. "I have been having some second thoughts about all this. First of all, it is not all that proper to be bringing a young girl and, "Old lady," suggested Agatha with a grin that Rita decided looked dangerous. "Yes, quite. Well, anyway, it is only natural that you would be frightened by such a... If your driving did not frighten me, I do not see how anything inside that house can." Agatha stepped toward Rita and extended one hand. "Agatha Crane, parapsychologist. You must be Rita." "Yes'm," said Rita. "And unless my Excuse me, I lost my place. And unless I miss my guess, this is William Yorick, our resident thespian. Yorick gave his little bow again. The lady is too kind. The dead are my only audience these days, although I could not ask for any more attentive than they. Then we are all here. Let us be about our business. The old lady pulled open the leather satchel, and in her hand, and settled the oddest piece of headgear Rita had ever seen over her soft, white curls. It was like a jeweler's eyepiece, and with extra lenses on delicate wire arms. They pushed through the gate, Fairmont bringing up the rear and complaining. "Technically, this is breaking and entering," he said. "We have no legal right to be here. If I am caught, it could be incredibly embarrassing for my business associates." "I thought you bought the house," murmured Rita. The closer the awful thing grew, the stranger the urge to whisper, as if not to wake it. "I tried to buy the house, which is how we found out who owns it now, yes. But the sale was never completed, because the look really oughtn't we come back in the morning." A scream cut through the night air from somewhere inside the mansion, and Agatha stomped up the steps and searched for the door handle. "No," said Fairmont, tugging at his tie. "No, I suppose not." Right, into the flavor text there. Using this booklet. This Learn to Play booklet is designed to teach new players how to play Mansions of Madness, 2nd edition. Players should read this booklet in its entirety before playing the first game. In an effort to teach the game simply and quickly, this booklet omits many rules and game interactions. Questions that arise during gameplay are best answered by the rules reference, which I'm not reading in this video. Game overview. Mansions of Madness is a cooperative game of investigation and horror, inspired by the writings of H.P. Lovecraft. During each game, 1 to 5 players explore a location to unravel a mystery. Players must work together to overcome the challenges presented to them by a fully integrated companion app. Mansions of Madness is a cooperative game. All players are on the same team and win or lose together. The investigator's ultimate goal is to explore the scenario's map and piece together the evidence and clues required to solve the mystery. In addition, investigators need to overcome various challenges, including fending off terrible creatures, befriending non-player characters, and solving puzzles. There's a lot of commentary I'd like to add on to all this, being a fan of the 1st edition and having everything for it, but I'll just keep reading, perhaps save that for another video. Download the app. To download Mansions of Madness app, search for Mansions of Madness app on the Apple iOS App Store, Google Play Store, or other things here as well, such as their website. Alright, let's read forward on. So here we have a list of components, so just kind of skim through them quickly. The rule book, map tiles, investigator cards and matching figures, tokens for NPCs or person tokens, explore/site tokens, search/interact tokens, all sorts of things that go into the room as indicated by the app. We've got spell cards, condition cards, damage cards, horror cards, monster tokens, and matching monster figures. We have 5 dice, different than the 1st edition, which uses a 10-sided die. This one is, it looks like 8-sided. We got 26 clue tokens, and the 1st edition conversion kit, very useful for me, and common items and unique item cards as well. Alright, up next we have setup. Before playing each game, perform the following steps in order. The setup diagram on page 5 shows an example of these steps. 1. Create card decks. Separate the investigators from all other cards. They will be used later during setup. Then separate all other cards into decks by card type. Shuffle the damage and horror decks individually and place them face down within reach of all players. Organize the cards in the common item, unique items, spell, and condition decks alphabetically, and place them face up within reach of all players. This will make it easier to find cards when they are needed during the game. Step 2. Organize map tiles. Gather all map tiles and organize them by tile size. This will make it easier to find the tiles when they are needed during the game. Step 3. Organize monsters. Make sure each monster has a matching token slotted into its base. See monster figure reference on page 22 for the rules reference. Number 4. Create token pools. Separate all tokens into pools by token app. So far, those are all the kinds of standard items you generally would expect for any thematic game for the most part. Step 5. Choose scenario. Run the Mansions of Madness app and press New Game. Players as a group decide which story to play and input their selection in the app. First game. For the first game, players are recommended to play the Cycle of Eternity scenario. This scenario is shorter and less complex than the other scenarios, making it well suited for learning the game. Before choosing a scenario, if you own the first edition of Mansions of Madness base game, and any other of its expansions, excluding print on demand, I'll note, you can integrate the components of these products as described by the conversion kit rules insert, not spoken about here. Players can play any investigators from the integrated first edition products, and the app can use any of the monsters or map tiles from these products during the game. Step 6. Choose investigators. Each player chooses an investigator, taking the investigator card and figure for that investigator. Then input the selected investigators in the app. Hereafter, players will be referred to as investigators. If playing with only a single player, that player chooses 2 investigators and controls both of them. Unused investigator cards and figures are returned to the game box. All common sense so far. Number 7. Starting possessions. Investigators as a group gain the specific common items, spells, or other possessions as instructed by the app. These possessions may be distributed among the investigators however they decide. Different there from the first edition, but I suppose I can't stop for each comment on that. Number 8. Read prologue and reveal entrance. Perform the remaining steps of setup as instructed by the app. Read aloud the scenario's prologue as shown by the app. The story's prologue might provide hints about what is to come. Place a starting map tile and investigator figures as instructed by the app. Place the search tokens, explore tokens, and other tokens as instructed or indicated by the app. Perform any other steps as instructed by the app. So that was A, B, C, and D for step 8, read prologue and reveal entrance, basically setting up the opening tiles that you'll be on. And unlike some other games in the original Mansions, this one is still modular, but modular in a way that it builds up as you go, reminiscent of D&D adventure board games and Betrayal at House on the Hill in some ways. Playing the game. Mansions of Madness is played over a series of game rounds. Each round consists of 2 phases that are resolved in the following order. Phase 1. Investigator phase. Investigators perform actions to move about the game board, explore their surroundings, and attack monsters. Step 2. Mythos phase. The app indicates monster actions and generates mythos effects. These cards might spawn monsters or raise other challenges that investigators will need to overcome. After the mythos phase each round, investigators start a new round, beginning with the investigator phase. Players continue resolving rounds until they have won or lost the game. These phases are described in detail in the following pages and summarized on the last page of the rules reference. So it's just like original in that you have all the investigators other than the mythos phase, except the mythos phase is done by the app. No need for the trauma cards, mythos cards, and keeper action cards. A lot less that can go wrong during setup. And here we have a setup diagram for 2 players. We see the various types of cards up here, conditions, common items, etc. We've got the damage cards, the sanity cards, and then the various pools of tokens here as well, such as search, explore, non-player characters. We see an initial room set up here with areas that can be searched and explored. We see what a room tile looks like over there, some monsters that have been set up with the tiles in their bases, and then the investigators set up with initial starting items, and of course the app here, which could be on a tablet or, as I understand it, a laptop hopefully, and or your phone, but I suppose that would be small. Alright, up next, Investigator phase. During the Investigator phase, each investigator performs up to 2 actions. Performing actions is the primary way in which investigators move about the game board and interact with their surroundings. The investigators take turns in the order of their choice. On an investigator's turn, he performs up to 2 actions of his choice. Then the next investigator takes his turn, and so on, until each investigator has taken a turn. During the investigator phase, investigators perform the following actions. The detailed rules for these actions are explained in the following sections. First is the move action. As a move action, the investigator moves his figure up to 2 spaces. Up to 2 spaces, moving 1 space at a time. From 1 space to an adjacent space. He cannot move through walls or impassable borders unless an effect specifically allows him to. If an investigator attempts to move out of a space that contains a monster, he must resolve an evade check. See evading monsters on page 14. Next is the explore action. The investigator uses the app to explore an adjacent room. To do so, he taps the explore token that corresponds to the area he wants to explore. Then he confirms this action by selecting the explore option. The investigator resolves the effect as instructed by the app. The effect indicates which map tile or tiles to be placed, as well as any search, interact, person, or other tokens. After all tiles and tokens have been placed, the investigators may move into the explored area as instructed by the app. So rather than just moving into a new place and it appears, like Betrayed House on the Hill, it does take an action to explore, but then hopefully it instructs you to move in straight away after you do so, unless there's some other thing at hand. That's an action to explore a new room or area. Here we have a map tile breakdown. It's kind of showing the different spots. It shows that there are spaces, which are smaller than rooms usually, and that's how you move each one. A border represented by solid white or yellow. They divide up places and larger areas, or they divide up the spaces rather. Number 3 is impassable borders. You can't go through them unless you have a special. Same with monsters. Number 4 is walls, which are brown borders. Also, you can't pass through unless you have an effect that lets you. 5 is doors, represented by rectangle gaps in the walls. Investigators and monsters can move through doors. And 6 is a room, which is a series. It's a group of spaces separated from other rooms by walls, doors, yellow, or borders, impassable borders, or edges of the map tiles. Each room has a single name that refers to all the spaces in the room. So you may have to walk through several spaces in a single room, and you may search multiple things in a room, but each space of movement is a space, even if there's more than one space in a room. Up next with actions, we have the search action. This is where you're clicking on the question mark icons and exploring what's underneath them. The investigator uses the app to search something of interest in his space. You must be in the space. To do so, he taps a search token in his space, then he confirms his action by selecting the search option. The investigator resolves the effect as instructed by the app, which might include a skill test, declared as a skill icon embedded in parentheses following a short narrative. For example, you dig through the dense paperwork, cluttering the desk, looking for anything of interest. Eyeball, in parentheses, instructs the investigators to test his observation, So it's eyeball in parentheses. So whenever you get a symbol for a certain attribute, that just means test that attribute. So eyeball in parentheses, test observation. See skill test on page 13. Up next is the trade action. The investigator may give any number of common items, unique items, or spells to each investigator in his space, and allow those investigators to give him any number of their possessions. Additionally, you may pick up or drop any number of the common items, unique items, or spell items. So trade lets you switch and swap between the space you're in and the people who are with you, and that takes an action. A little box here, using the app to perform actions. Performing the explore action, search action, interact action, and some component actions require using the app. An investigator may tap any token in the app to inspect it. Doing so does not require an action, and the investigator can inspect the token, even if the token is not in his space. An investigator cannot select an option that is preceded by the action icon, unless he spins an action to do so. Performing the explore, search, or interact option allows the investigator to select such an option. So the app makes it clear what takes an action, one of your two actions per turn, in order to do. Let's look at the next section here. Interact action. The investigator uses the app to interact with a person or the object in his space. To do so, he taps a person or interacts token in his space. Then he confirms his action by selecting the option preceded by the action icon, which is there again. The investigator resolves the effect as instructed by the app, which might include additional decisions or a skill test. Some components or effects allow investigators to perform component actions. Component actions are described by the component or effect that allows the investigator to perform that action. Component actions on cards are preceded by the word action in bold and can be performed by the investigator who has that card. Some items allow investigators to perform a component action by using the app. To do so, the investigator opens the inventory by pressing the inventory button on the bottom left corner of the screen and selects the item. That button looks like a little backpack or satchel on the lower left corner. And as we see for a component action here, the bandage card says action. You can use it, discard up to 2 face down damages, and discard this card. After doing the component action, you confirm the action by selecting the option preceded by the action icon. Basically, anytime you do a kind of action, you'll confirm that you want to spend an action to do so, whether it's search, component, explore, or whatever. Next is the action, that's the attack action. Investigators use the app to attack a monster. To do so, he selects the monster that he wants to attack from the monster drawer. Then he presses the attack button. Looks like the monster drawer is kind of in the lower middle of the app, at some stages at least. The investigator must choose how he wants to attack and confirm his action by selecting one of the following options. Attack with a heavy weapon, attack with a bladed weapon, attack with a firearm, attack with a spell, or attack unarmed. After his attack type, he resolves the effect, which often includes a skill test, as instructed by the app. The investigator uses the plus and minus buttons in the monster menu to record damage the monster has suffered. So the app keeps track of how damaged the monsters are, even though they are walking around physically. You no longer have to place little symbols on them to show how damaged they are. Selecting a monster. To select a monster, an investigator opens the monster drawer by pressing the monster drawer button. Then he presses a monster icon in the drawer to select it. This will open the monster menu from which an investigator can attack or evade the monster or alter the amount of damage the monster has suffered. An investigator using a weapon or spell with the melee icon can attack only a monster in his space. An investigator using a weapon or spell with the ranged icon can attack any monster within range. So the little knife, sword icon, that means just in your space. Little gun icon means it's ranged, and that's how that works. Some effects, such as range attacks, horror checks, and monster effects, rely on range. The maximum ranges for these effects is 3 spaces. Range cannot be counted through walls or doors unless an effect specifically allows it. So, sounds like all things being equal, the range for ranged weapons and spells is 3 spaces. Up next is the end of the investigator phase. After all investigators have taken a turn, one of them presses the end phase button in the bottom right corner of the screen to end the investigator phase and proceed to the mythos phase. Here we have an attack action example. It's showing Carson Sinclair uses the attack action to attack a deep one in his space. He opens the monster drawer by pressing the monster drawer button on the bottom left corner of the screen and selects the deep one. He presses the attack button. Carson decides to attack with his crowbar, a heavy weapon, as indicated on the crowbar card. He selects the attack action with heavy weapon option on the app. After that, the app instructs him to test his strength in this case. So he looks at that. It's a strength guy in parentheses, so test strength. His strength is 3. Then up next, he rolls 3 dice to correspond with that. He rolls 2 successes, which are indicated by the elder sign symbol on the dice, and 1 blank result. The test declaration in the app indicates a test difficulty of 2, meaning he needs 2 successes results to pass. Up next, after having passed the test, Carson damages the deep one to suffer damage equal to his weapon's damage. So because he was successful with getting the required 2, his weapon damage, which is 2 from the crowbar as shown on the card, does that damage to him. Finally, Carson records the damage that the deep one has suffered by using the app. Up next, we have the mythos phase. During the mythos phase, the app generates a number of effects to be resolved by the investigators. There are 3 types of effects that the app can generate: mythos events, monster activations, and horror checks. These effects are described in the following sections. The first is mythos events. Mythos events are effects generated by the app during the mythos phase. Mythos events might be related to a specific scenario investigators have chosen, or the actions the investigators have performed during the round. The investigators resolve the effects as instructed by the app. After all mythos events for the round have been resolved, the app will generate instructions for activating monsters. If there are no monsters on the board, the mythos phase will end automatically. Monster activations. The app generates instructions for activating each monster, one at a time. These instructions will describe how to move each monster and how each monster attacks. The investigator resolves the effects as instructed by the app. See monster activation example diagram on page 11. After all monsters have attacked for the round, the app will instruct investigators to resolve horror checks, which brings us to horror checks. The app instructs each investigator to resolve a horror check against a single monster within range. Each investigator resolves a horror check against the monster within range with the highest horror rating. If an investigator is not within range of any monsters, he does not resolve horror check. To resolve a horror check against the monster, the investigator selects the monster from the monster drawer and resolves the effect as instructed by the app. After all investigators have finished resolving horror checks, one of them passes the end phase button, or presses the end phase button in the bottom right corner of the screen to end the mythos phase and begin the next round. Winning the game During setup, players will select a scenario to determine what the investigators need to do to win the game. However, the objective is hidden from the investigators. During the game, the investigators must unravel the mystery and discover that their ultimate goal. The investigators can do so by listening carefully to the scenario's prologue and carefully examining each hint they discover throughout the investigation. After the investigation has progressed enough, the objective will be revealed, giving the investigators one final task to complete. Investigators win the game when the investigation is complete. If the investigators take too long to complete the investigation, the scenario's objective might change or become more difficult to accomplish. If the investigators continue to take too long, they will lose the game. Next here we have a monster activation example. It shows during the Mythos phase, the app opens the monster menu and generates the effect of each monster activation. So we can kind of see that here. It shows the app generates movement instructions for the Deep One and specifies which investigator the Deep One attacks. The investigator follows the app instructions by moving the Deep One towards the nearest investigator. The Deep One attacks the investigator in its space who has suffered the most damage. Agatha selects the Monster Attacks option, and the app generates the effects of the Deep One's attack. The effect instructs Agatha to test her strength. Strong guy in parentheses is the symbol for that. She does so by rolling dice equal to her strength value printed on her card. She rolls one success, one elder sign, and one blank result, unable to re-roll dice or convert any other results to an elder sign symbol. She continues to resolve the effects. The effects generated by the app instruct Agatha to suffer 2 face-down damage, negated by the results of her strength test. Agatha's single elder sign negates 1 face-down damage, but she suffers the remaining 1 face-down damage. Having completely resolved the effect, Agatha presses the Continue button. The Deep One's activation is complete. May have to look that over in the reference to make sure I understand combat. Additional rules. This section includes additional rules not previously discussed, including skill tests, cards, features, monsters, and puzzles. So up next we have damage and horror. Many game effects cause investigators to suffer damage or horror. When an effect causes an investigator to suffer damage or horror, he draws the top card of the damage or horror deck, respectively. They look like heart-like card and the brain card. Each damage or horror card has one of the 2 traits: resolve immediately or keep face up. When an investigator claims a face-up damage card or horror with the resolve immediately trait, he immediately resolves its effect, which usually includes flipping the card face down. A damage or a horror with the keep facing up trait will have a lasting effect for as long as the card remains face up. So it could be immediate damage or something that's more of a long-term problem. Wounded. When an investigator has suffered damage, whether face up or face down, equal to his health, the investigator becomes wounded. When an investigator becomes wounded, he gains a wounded condition and discards all his face-down damage. While wounded, an investigator cannot perform the move action more than once each round. When a wounded investigator has suffered damage equal to his health, that investigator is eliminated. So, when you're wounded, you're half dead, and you're also walking more slowly. Then when you go through all your life again, you're completely gone and dead. Up next is insane. When an investigator has suffered horror, whether face up or face down, equal to his sanity, that investigator becomes insane. When an investigator becomes insane, he gains an insane condition and discards all of his face down horror cards. He reads the back of his insane condition, but he cannot reveal the back to the other investigators. An investigator's insane condition might alter how the investigator wins or loses the game. In such a case, he may want to perform one of many actions that he would not otherwise want to perform. See rarely used actions on the last page of the rules reference. I also recommend that folks print out Investigator's Action Guide from Board Game Geek, which is a quick reference for all the types of actions you can do. Each insane condition has a required number of investigators, which is indicated on the bottom right corner, on the back of the card. When an investigator gains an insane condition, if the number of investigators is less than the required number of investigators, he discards that card and gains a different copy of the insane condition. If an insane investigator has suffered horror equal to his sanity, that investigator is eliminated. So if you're already insane from losing all your horror, then you go crazy again. You just die wallowing in despair, one supposes, and mania. But having a secret condition when you're insane is already dangerous enough. But obviously, if it says 3+ and you only have 2 people playing, you need to get a new card, is what it's describing. A new condition for insanity. Eliminated. When an investigator is eliminated, he drops all of his possessions in his space and removes his investigator from the board. The remaining investigators have a single additional investigator phase to attempt to complete their investigation. At the end of their investigator phase, if the investigators did not complete the investigation, they lose the game. One of them selects the Investigator Eliminated option from the in-game menu to end the game. Alright, up next we have skill tests. A skill test represents a physical, mental, or social challenge an investigator must overcome. Skill tests are declared using their skill icon embedded in parentheses, following a short narrative. When an investigator is resolving an effect that includes a skill icon in the text, he must immediately resolve that skill. To resolve a test, the investigator rolls a number of dice equal to his value in the indicated skill. The number of success results, which is the elder sign symbol, rolled is called the test results. The test declaration might also indicate a modifier, such as -1, which causes the investigator to roll more or fewer dice in the skill test. Investigators roll a minimum of 1 die for each test, no matter what. For example, you uncover a series of strange cryptic runes carved into the wall. It shows a book -1, which means test lore -1. Instructs the investigator to test his lore, rolling 1 fewer die than normal. So the -1 or +1 doesn't mean add it to the result or add that many successes or take away that many successes. It's just adding or taking away a total die that you'll roll, trying to get successes. Negating damage and horror. Some effects cause an investigator to suffer multiple damage or horror at the same time, but allow him to resolve a skill test that negates some or all of the damage or horror. To do so, the investigator tests the indicated skill. He prevents 1 damage or 1 horror for each success, elder sign, rolled. Skill test difficulty. Some skill test declarations include a test difficulty embedded in parentheses, separated from the skill icon by a semicolon. The number indicates the number of success results, elder signs, required to pass a test. If the investigator does not roll enough elder signs, he fails the test. So for example, the beast charges at you, lore, semicolon, 2. Or rather, it's an agility symbol. It's like a wing or maybe a racing leg. And it says, so it has agility, semicolon 2. This instructs the investigator to test agility with a difficulty of 2. If the investigator rolls 2 or more elder signs, they pass the test. So sometimes tests just want you to get at least 1 success. Other times it'll specifically tell you you need these many successes. Some skill test declarations include the app instructions require the investigators to input his test results. In such a case, the investigator uses the plus and minus buttons to input the results. That shows the investigator inputting the results on the app. The number of elder signs successes required to pass is unknown. However, even if the investigator fails the test, the app remembers how many elder signs were previously rolled. Future attempts to pass the test will require fewer elder signs. Little side note, that's lovely because that way you can't be overly frustrated from just getting bad luck, and it shows that persistence is perhaps helping you with a given job, which is a really nice thing to automatically be incorporated into the app. Message log. During the game, all messages displayed in the app are recorded in the message log. Looks kind of like an open book. Players may access the message log at any time, selecting message log from the in-game menu. In-game menu, the message log is organized by round and allows players to reread messages shown by the app throughout the course of the game. So if you learn clues by looking into something or investigating something, you'll essentially have a journal saving all that information that you can look back on. Up next is monsters. Monsters represent aberrant and eldritch creatures, and the cultists and other worshippers of these creatures. Monster token. Each monster token includes a number of pieces of game information, as described below. With the front of the deep one, we see the awareness in the upper right. The monster's awareness is referenced when an investigator resolves an evade check in a space that contains multiple monsters. The second thing we look at is the lower right, and that's the horror rating. The horror rating is referenced when an investigator resolves a horror check within range of multiple monsters. The third thing is on the back, which will be on the bottom inside the bases of the monsters. And it's the lower right on the bottom, and that's the brawn. A monster's brawn represents its physical prowess and is represented by referenced by various effects. See barricades on page 16. Number 4 is ability and flavor text. So the ability for the deep one here is aquatic. The monster can move through impassable borders that represent water. And then there's flavor text underneath that, which is nice. ID tokens. ID tokens are used to mark unique monsters and to differentiate from others of the same type. When a monster is spawned, the app might indicate one of the 6 ID tokens to be assigned to that monster. An investigator places a specified ID token in the monster figure base. Interesting. Up next is evading monsters. If an investigator in a space containing a monster attempts to leave his space or perform an action other than the attack action or move action, that investigator must first evade the monster. If there are multiple monsters in the investigator's space, he must evade only the monster with the highest awareness. So that's an important distinction. You don't have to evade every monster if you are performing an action other than attack, which includes move if you're moving out of the space. To evade a monster, an investigator selects the monster in his space from the monster drawer. Then the investigator presses the evade button and resolves the effect as instructed by the app. After evading a monster, the investigators perform his action as normal, unless the effect states that his action is forfeit. If the investigator forfeits his action, he loses his action without resolving any parts of its effect. If an investigator forfeits his action while moving, he loses any remaining movement and does not leave his space. See evade check example diagram on page 15. Spells. Spells represent the tomes or scrolls containing the knowledge required to harness eldritch powers. When an investigator gains a spell, he claims a random copy of the spell face up, art side up. An investigator cannot look at the back of the spell until an effect causes the spell to flip. When an investigator casts the spell effects instructs the investigator to flip the card. When he flips the card, he immediately resolves the effect on its back. The effects typically include discarding the card and gaining a new copy of the same spell. Conditions. Conditions represent intangible status effects that alter how an investigator acts. Occasionally, an effect will cause an investigator to gain a condition. For example, become stunned causes the investigator to gain the stunned condition. Here's an evade check example. It shows Agatha Crane wants to move to do the search token in the office, but will need to move away from the deep one to do so. She attempts to move out of the deep one space, but she must resolve an evade check. She selects the deep one from the monster drawer and presses evade button. The app generates an effect for her evade check. The effect instructs Agatha to test her agility. She does so by rolling dice equal to her agility value printed on her card. She rolls 2 investigation results and 1 blank result. Agatha needs 2 successes results to pass, so she spins 2 clues to convert the investigation symbols or magnifying glasses to elder signs, which are successes. So clearly it sounds like clues, which are a token or an item you get, can be used to turn clue results or investigation results on the dice you roll into elder signs, which are successes. So that's useful. Agatha resolves the pass effect as instructed by the app. The deep one suffers 1 damage. Agatha was not instructed to forfeit her action, so she resolves her action as normal. She moves into the other space of the office. Agatha can now perform the second action on her turn. Because she is no longer in the same space as a monster, she does not need to resolve an evade check. So she went to do something else, so it had to do the evade check. She was successful, and being part of that successful, the app didn't prompt her to lose her move. So that was a total win for her, it sounds like. Up next we have features. Features represent noteworthy furnishings or environmental effects that investigators can interact with, or that affect how investigators can interact with his surroundings. All features are square tokens. Interacting with a feature does not require the app. A barricade is the first kind. A barricade, looking kind of like a shelf, allows an investigator to block a door to prevent a monster from getting through. As an action, an investigator in a space containing a barricade may move the barricade against the door or move the barricade away from the door it blocks. Investigators and monsters cannot move through blocked doors. However, a monster can destroy a barricade that blocks its path. If a monster attempts to move through a blocked door, it rolls a number of dice equal to its brawn. If it rolls 2 or more successes, the barricade is discarded, it's destroyed, and the monster breaks through the door and moves as normal. Otherwise, the monster does not move. Darkness. Darkness hinders an investigator's ability to resolve skill tests and puzzles. An investigator in a space containing darkness cannot spin clues to convert dice results to or perform additional puzzle steps. Each investigator in or adjacent to a space containing a light source or fire ignores the effect of darkness. So that's easy to remember because it makes sense. Light sources and fire negate darkness, which will make it so that you can't use clues to convert dice results or perform additional puzzle steps. That's what darkness does. Up next is fire. Fire spreads and can damage investigators and monsters. Whenever an investigator moves into a space containing fire or performs an action in a space containing fire, he suffers 1 face-down damage from that damage card deck. Whenever a monster starts its activation in a space containing fire or moves into a containing fire, it suffers 1 damage. As an action, investigator may attempt to extinguish the flame by testing agility, and for each success rolled, alert sign he rolls, he may discard 1 fire token from his space or a space he moves into if he moves as part of his second action or later in the round. So, multiple successes, you could potentially move more than 1 fire token. At the beginning of each Mythos phase, fire spreads. If 1 or more spaces contains the fire, place 1 fire token in a space adjacent to the space that contains the fire. So it could spread quickly if, during each Mythos phase, it spreads to every adjacent space. Up next is Secret Passage. An investigator or monster in a space containing a secret passage can move to any other space containing a secret passage as if those were adjacent. It makes perfect sense, just like before. Up next is puzzles. Occasionally, an investigator will encounter an effect that requires him to solve a puzzle. Puzzles represent complex logical, magical, or physical challenges the investigators must overcome to complete their investigation. Puzzles are resolved in their entirety using the app. The type of puzzles, slide puzzle, lock puzzle, and code puzzle, are described on page 18. Puzzle steps. A puzzle step is a single unit of progress towards solving a puzzle, and the type of puzzle steps the investigator can perform are defined by the type of puzzle he is resolving, as indicated by the app. Whenever an effect instructs an investigator to attempt a puzzle, that investigator performs a number of puzzle steps equal to his value in the skill indicated by that effect. While attempting a puzzle, an investigator may spend any number of his clues to perform 1 additional puzzle step for each clue spent, except when you're in darkness, of course. After an investigator has performed all of his allowed puzzle steps, if the puzzle is not solved, he presses the close button. The investigator's progress will be saved so that he or another investigator can continue solving the puzzle at a later time. Solving a puzzle. The app will automatically detect when a puzzle is solved, at which point the investigators who solve the puzzle will continue resolving his action as instructed by the app. We see here a slide puzzle. Slide puzzle is a type of puzzle in which the investigator attempts to assemble an image that has been split into 6 or more pieces. The pieces of a slide puzzle are displayed in a grid and randomized. As a puzzle step, the investigator can swap any 2 adjacent pieces by dragging one of them over the other. The puzzle is solved when all pieces in the puzzle are in the correct position and the puzzle's image is properly displayed. So it's rearranging